Hi, folks. We're doing the last part of the PowerPoint that Pearson's has helped us out with. I've added a few things to it and taken out some stuff, but I hope you're enjoying China so far. This will be our last assignment before we leave for Japan. And where we left off was at the end of the Suri dynasty, and the turning point, we're in a transitional zone where we're starting to come up with a very important period of time called the Tang Dynasty. This is part of the Suri dynasty down here, and you'll see that Buddhism has spread towards China, carried on the Silk Road. When in Western history we talk about empire, a lot of the times we talk about the Roman Empire, and we think about the fact that from Italy, all of the Roman emperors who reached out and managed to take over many different cultures and many different countries and managed to hold it all together for a while. So traditionally, we're talking China being about this big, but you can see that during the Tang Dynasty, you actually have extended the influence and the governingship of China to a much larger area. So down here is India, and the Silk Road is running. Well, actually, I was just reading in Japan, the Silk Road actually started in Japan, but a lot of the times it's from central China. And then the Silk Road heads out over and through Afghanistan and through Iran, and it's almost as far as Turkey. The Silk Road keeps going, but during the Tang Dynasty, Chinese had control and influence in all of the governance of these other countries that were now subjugated to Tang rulers. And notice the dates up here. I always like to think about what's happening at 1000 AD, and there's some pretty interesting things happening. So here you have 1000 AD, and China is in the middle of its ascendance to importance and power right about that time. You have already found that different areas of countries take Buddhism and they enhance, or they treat specially certain parts of Buddhism. And during this time, the Western Paradise this is the area that souls went to. They went to the Western Paradise. In Christianity, if you're good, you go to heaven, and in Buddhism, especially this sect, you went to the Western Paradise. And you'll notice that it's a wall painting in a cave, and those caves were situated along the Silk Road up in the deserty parts of China. And you'll notice here that we have the Tang Dynasty. So pretty elaborate type of imagery. A temple right here, and you're starting to see the roof that slopes up at the corners. And if I remember right, they're kind of similar to the gargoyles that we have on churches in Europe. And it's supposed to be an exit strategy for any sort of negative spirits or negative karma. They're supposed to flow off of the roof and up into the sky back again. So 782. Now the stupa has transformed itself into a pagoda. And this is still a reliquary. This is still a place where artifacts of famous Buddhist figures are enshrined, and a place that pilgrims will visit. But the stupa that was a circular dome has now turned into a tower instead of a dome. So here is our dome. You're remembering that the great stupa at Sanchi, and now we're seeing things changing. This is 2nd century BC, and now we're starting to see not BC, but we're seeing the Common Era, and we're starting to see a vertical look to that. So here you have another in China, different dynasties, how this half circular dome has now started to change into a taller structure. And some of them are made of wood. Some of them are having to be reconstructed because they're so old, but they try and rebuild them. So they said it's Tang style dynasty, even though the last ruler of the Tang started to get disconnected from his government, started to fall in love with a young lady, and that led to a revolution. Now, one of the great things during the Tang Dynasty was that the Chinese people interacted with foreigners. Remember, the attitude of China was that they were the people and everybody else was inferior. But this road that goes from Chanang to Rome, 5,000 miles, they allowed foreigners to come through. Now, if we didn't have COVID, we would be taking a field trip to the Phoenix Art Museum. And they have a very good collection that samples many of the Asiatic countries. And I can clearly recollect these 3 glazes. So when you see this kind of yellow and this kind of green and this kind of color patterns, and it's kind of a runny looking glaze, then you're probably looking at something that's coming from 700 AD. They loved, since there was a caravan-centered country, they loved to pay homage to horses. And by the way, that's a pretty good looking horse. Good front quarters on that horse. A lot of these horses came out of Mongolia, and they're pretty sturdy. And the Chinese warrior class, they certainly like this kind of horse. So here's a couple more sculptures. Looks like they're about 15 inches tall, and they may have been tomb. I'm not sure. Now, Song Dynasty pulls back. The size of the country shrinks, and remember I told you that in between every dynasty there was a period of turmoil. So when the Tang Dynasty unraveled, people really did. They pulled away. They went to their country homes if they could. They stayed away from the big cities. They didn't want to be involved in crazy politics. And they worked at being gentlemen scholars. In fact, there were some gentle lady scholars, and people didn't really know that for a while, but we record all of the artwork from the men, and slowly we're uncovering some of the artwork from women in history as well. So I personally am kind of in love with this time period because poetry was so important, and painting, a very brush wash type of painting. Here is a bodhisattva, Guanyin, and I say she, but you'll notice that the book will say he, so this is another one of those. It's not a deity, it is a person on the brink of enlightenment. And in Buddhism, if you want to make a parallel between Christianity and Buddhism, you would say that this is Mary. And if you travel into southern Arizona and you go to San Javier del Bac, you'll see sculptures to Mary. If you go into Mexico, you'll see all sorts of chapels, and people pray to Mary, and they pray for health, and they pray for guidance. And Guanyin is similar. If you were a person who was worried about civil unrest, or if you were worried about disease or famine, which were true, they were realities. You just didn't go down to the grocery store and stock up. If you had a drought, you got hungry, and some people died from starvation. So Guanyin was the bodhisattva that people prayed to for safety and help. One of my favorite artists, Fan Quan, and you'll notice that this is 7 feet tall. So if I draw a person standing, if I draw a person standing next to a 6-foot person standing next to, this piece of artwork is quite tall. Now, this opens up the fact that sometimes the scrolls were not meant to be unrolled and hung. In this case, the hanging scroll, it probably did spend a lot of time open. But a scroll, you've kind of seen them. They're kind of wrapped up on one end, and they might even have a stick or something coming out of the end of it, like a rolling pin. And then on the other end, you had another. If you know anything about roll film cameras from the old days, this is exactly what it was like. You had a take-up end on it up here. So you would open up the scroll and you would only look at a small part of the scroll at a time. And you would roll this up and this would unroll. And then you would roll that up and then you would unroll. So as you went along, you would see almost like a movie or a piece of cinematic art. You would see different things as you traveled up through the painting. Other thing that I'd like you to think about, and hopefully maybe you can sneak into the art museum. I'm not sure what their policies are now, but your student ID card should get you free entrance at any time. But check before you go. And if you can go in, you'll see some of these hanging scrolls. Not this one. This one is pretty darn famous. But you'll see some hanging scrolls. And what I'd like you to look for is a painted pathway. And this was a very important part of many of these scrolls. And so you might find here there's a little stream, and you might find a boat where you had to get on the ferry boat and you had to move across. And there might be a little tiny town right here. And this path was provided by the artist, and you would get hints. Every once in a while there might be a little bench or a little place with nobody sitting there. But that is for you to sit down and look all around you and see what you can see from there. And then the pathway keeps going, and maybe over here you're going to see the waterfall up here. So this is a convention in Chinese art, and it's meant to bring you it's not just an eye traffic pattern, it's literally a storytelling pathway through the picture. Here's another, and at this time, many of these were done with silk, and many of these are done with ink. So you can think back to the great tools of the gentleman scholar, and that was your ink stone and your brushes and your wash. And if you zero in on some of these trees and some of these rocks, you're going to get the feeling that you're looking at calligraphy. And that's because you were trained, if you were one of these gentleman scholar type of people, you were trained in calligraphy, and then you took your skills and you translated it into painting. So here's a very busy type of picture here, which is kind of like a time capsule, and it throws you right back to 1000 AD so that you could kind of get a feeling of the hustle and the bustle of this city. Now, Southern Sun is a little bit different, and the term that we would use for a picture like this is minimalism. Okay, I'm going to use light blue because it's such a spiritual color. And during this time period, some artists challenged themselves and they kind of said, how much can I leave out? How much can I not paint and still have a very sound and wonderful piece of artwork? Okay, remember that this is a scroll and you're going to start over here on this end and you're only going to see a little bit at a time. So you're going to start here with a boat and it has two people in it. And other than that, it just has a lot of gray, washy types of things. And this is called the Kung. And the most important part of a early scroll was to wet down the silk and then to add very soft, gentle washes to it so that the whole thing starts to look like mist. It starts to look like fog. And then as the wash starts to dry, then you see the artist using calligraphic strokes and they start to bring things out of the Kung. So everything in this type of painting, you think that everything comes from unformed matter, and this gets kind of cosmic. That everything exists in an unformed state, and they're just little dots, just little things of matter, and then due to certain things, certain actions, etc., then they come together and they make stuff. You know, this is stuff that came from the Kung, and it's a boat and it's people. And then here's some other stuff that originated out of this cosmic dust cloud that's just this type of wash that's in the background. So this is one level. These gentlemen scholars that used to be court officials, they used to be very important in the governing of the territory, and now they have escaped and they've kind of gone into their own self-imposed quarantine, to use a good word. When they painted a picture like this many times, what you saw looked like nature. But if you were alive at that time and you were familiar with the politics at that time, there was a whole layer of symbolism and iconography. And so, you know, the boat with the people might have stood for a certain emperor or a certain rebel or something like that. The trees talk about a certain kind of stability. The rocks talk about obstacles in the government. The ship over here, or whatever this is over here, that might be somebody's idea on how to change something. So it all looks to us like nature. But if you put on your glasses. Remember how you got to put on those glasses if you can learn about this time period and what was going on politically, and you can put on those glasses and you can look at this, you may experience the whole thing in a different fashion. And here's another beautiful minimalistic. They did not talk about minimalism because all of this is unformed matter. It's actually full, but it's only certain portions of it have been delineated and formed out. So personally, when I draw and sometimes when I photograph, I like to take the Bauhaus challenge, and we're never going to get to the Bauhaus, but in the 1930s, it was a school of international modernism, and they said, do more with less. You've probably heard that someplace. And even though it's old fashioned now, it's over, well, it's getting close to about 100 years. 1920 is when they were starting this. Even though it's about 100 years old, there are artists today who love minimalism. They just like to say, I'm going to give you some clues. As a visual artist, I'm going to give you some hints, and I want you to engage in it. I want you to bounce the ideas around. So that's kind of, I think that's a little bit of the same sort of thing that's happening here. You cannot leave China without looking at ceramics. In my first artist life, I did pottery. I love pottery. GCC has a great program. Phoenix College has a really good program. Paradise Valley has a good program in ceramics. And there is something magical about taking a lump, a ball of mud, for lack of a better term. It's a special kind of mud. It's clay. There's something really neat about sitting down at a potter's wheel and centering that little, well, may not be so little, that mound of clay, and making a little stupa. You kind of start out by making a stupa on a revolving wheel, and then you open that up. It becomes kind of like a clay donut, and then you pull the walls and you shape the walls, and if you work on it too long, it collapses and turns into just a bunch of mud. But if you get all of your timing right, you can make a beautiful, beautiful vessel. This looks like glass, but it is not. This is probably, oh, it says stoneware. Okay. So that's a high-fired clay. It's not a terracotta. It's something that can hold water or it could hold wine. Terracotta clay is like a flower pot, and if you fill it up with water, it'll seep through. The North American Indians up on the reservation, the native people up there make ollas, and the Mexican culture, they make ollas, which are water jugs, and it has to be made out of terracotta because they want the water to seep out the edges and evaporate, and that cools the water that's inside of that water jug. This is the opposite. This has been in the kiln longer. I think I'm going to find okay, maybe in Japan, I'm going to find a climbing kiln video so that you can see how they did this. They really raised the temperatures up high, and now the stoneware is the clay, and then it says here that you have a crackled grayish blue glaze. Now, glaze is a form of glass, and you can beautify your stoneware by putting a glaze over it. And what they talk about is the fit of the glaze over the clay body. And as it's fired in the kiln, everything expands and everything contracts. You put in if this vase was 7 inches tall, probably was closer to 9 inches tall before it was fired. There's a certain amount of shrinkage that takes place when you drive all of the water out of the clay and it turns into stoneware. So the clay body is expanding and contracting, and the glaze, which is like a film over the top of the clay, that expands and contracts as well. And if you want this crackle pattern, and a lot of people love crackling, they like this crackle pattern, then you want to have a glaze that doesn't quite fit exactly. And so the clay body is shrinking more than the glaze, and the glaze has to crack in order to continue to hang on. So these there were towns in China that were just absolute ceramics factories, and there was trade that was going out to Europe, and this is later. This is in the maybe this was 13th century, but later in the 1500s and 1600s, you had people who were trading with Europe, and they would load up ocean-going junk, one of those wonderful, very cool, old-fashioned looking sailboats. They would they just load it with this big cargo filled with ceramics and trade with other cultures. Unfortunately for them, on occasion, the ship would sink. And fortunately for us, when we can locate any of these shipwrecks and we can pull the cargo up out of the bottom of the ocean floor, these are in immaculate conditions. The ceramics, they just don't wear, they don't weather, they don't change. Even over 400 or 500 years, they come out looking just like they were on the showroom floor. So that's just another side type of art history. Maybe you're interested in ceramics. It is a really fun and fulfilling kind of activity.